You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 21st of April, 2025, on Monocle Radio.
The life and legacy of Pope Francis, the questionable value of ceasefires, and the even more questionable value of influencers. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Daniella, Peled and Alex von Tunzelmann will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the UK's foremost country songwriter of recent years about how not to have a hit. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and we will hear from Daniella, Peled and Alex von Tunzelmann shortly. But we start with today's news of the death of Pope Francis, aged 88, one day after he greeted Easter Sunday crowds in St. Peter's Square and met briefly with US Vice President J.D. Vance. Francis became Pope in 2013 following the surprise abdication of Pope Benedict XVI. Francis was the first Jesuit pontiff, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, the first from the Americas, and the first from outside Europe in more than 1,000 years. Well, I'm joined first of all by Juliet Linley, journalist and former Vatican correspondent. Juliet, aside from that quite obviously impressive array of firsts, how would you quantify Francis's legacy?
Hi, Andrew. Well, if you want to look at the impact that Francis has had on the church, it's got to at least in part be, I guess, through the lens of his background. He was the son of Italians from a poor background up in northern Italy. They emigrated to Argentina, and his papacy has focused a lot on outliers, on refugees, immigrants, the poor. And in his autobiography, Hope, which he released earlier this year, he talks about the hardship that his family faced as immigrants. And his first trip, Andrew, when he became Pope in 2013, you'll remember, was to the Italian island of Lampedusa. That's between Sicily and North Africa. And he chose it because of its position where so many migrants lose their lives in the sea trying to reach Europe via the Mediterranean. Now, of course, the Pope also emphasized global engagement, diplomacy, peacemaking efforts. We can touch upon those a little later if you want. And then he was committed to the environment, and that was a key area for which he will be remembered. He often advocated for fighting climate change. He addressed numerous COP summits, UN conferences, and he always said that, you had to save the planet because climate change causes economic inequality and therefore social injustice. Then, of course, there's the aspect of the more controversial, if you want, aspects of his legacy, which are linked to the perceived failure to institute reforms on LGBTQ+, abortion issues, divorce. He went too far in the eyes of conservative Catholics, but then actually fell short of any doctrinal change, Andrew.
How unusual was that interest in papal diplomacy? Because he did visit some places which were pretty unusual for someone in his position, including Myanmar, South Sudan and Iraq. What was he hoping to accomplish on those trips?
Well, interesting that you mentioned those three countries, because clearly his point was always to bring attention to the conflict zones, but also to call, of course, for interreligious dialogue, to call for peace, for unity, for forgiveness. So in 2021, he was the first pope ever to visit Iraq. So his trip sent a powerful message from the war-ravaged country. And he was calling for reconciliation. He met with Muslim as well as Christian leaders. And that was a key interreligious dialogue moment, if you want. In Myanmar, he went there back in 2017, shining a spotlight on the Rohingya people. That was a really crucial moment. It was a controversial moment, and it was a sensitive trip during which he had to kind of walk a delicate diplomatic tightrope, and as he called for sort of the need for solidarity and compassion in their regard. And then you also you mentioned South Sudan. Well, he went there in 2023, again, war-torn country, ravaged by civil war in this case. And again, he was calling for peace, for unity, for forgiveness. And Andrew, as you know, Francis often called for peace between, Russians and Ukrainians. He also was very vocal on what is happening in Gaza. But if you want to look at the positive side, he's never managed to bring a lasting peace there. But he did, Vatican mediators did manage to bring home numerous Ukrainian prisoners of war from Russia. So that was a success for the Holy See diplomatic corps, if you want.
And does he leave a mark on the conduct of the office itself? Famously, he wasn't much interested in the fancy papal apartments or the gold embossed vestments and so on. Will it be hard for his successor to go back to that more regal approach?
I love that question. What you're actually asking me is, will the next pontiff favor boring black sneakers like Jorge Maria Bergoglio did, or is he going to want bright red ones like Joseph Ratzinger? Well, who can say, right? But again, is he going to want to live in the simple guest house at Santa Marta, which is what Francis chose, or is he going to want to return to the papal apartments? Seriously, you've got to wonder. But, maybe the next pope will even want to whisk out that white fur poncho-like cape that Benedict loved and Francis absolutely shunned. But on another level, Andrew, let's look at it. It goes beyond the trappings of papal garb. And this papacy was so much about streamlining, simplifying. Let's just look at how the Pope was adamant he wanted to get rid of the Latin Mass, which the conservatives love and therefore hate him for trying to get rid of. But your guess is as good as mine who's going to come next. But here's the thing. 80% of voting age cardinals were appointed by Francis. So you might guess, therefore, that perhaps his successor will as well issue the glitzier sides of being a pope. But wait for the conclave.
Juliet Linley, thank you for joining us. That was Juliet Linley, journalist and former Vatican correspondent. And there will be more from Juliet on tomorrow morning's episode of The Globalist, starting at 7 a.m. London. You are now listening to The Daily with me, Andrew Mueller, and I am joined in the studio today by Daniella Peled, managing editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and Alex von Tunzelmann, the historian, broadcaster and screenwriter. Pope-related stuff will recur later in the show, but I do want to do the usual catch-up as to what our guests have been doing. And Daniella, as regular listeners will be aware, you have usually been visiting obscurantist local history museums, and today it turns out is very much no exception.
Absolutely. You will not be disappointed, Andrew. I went to for a little bit of a sunshiny break in the lovely Canarian island of Fuerteventura. Mm-hmm. But as well as golden sand beaches and blue skies, it also has a trifecta of local history museums. The island's pearls. They're not known by me, but so there's the Museum of Cheese.
Excellent.
The Museum of Salt.
Outstanding.
And the Windmill Museum.
Fabulous.
You'll be glad to know that you can get a ticket which covers repeated entry to all three.
I would hope. Which was your favourite?
Oh, the cheese one. Without a doubt. We paid €3 extra for a tasting session. I mean, by the way, this isn't just cheese in general. This is one particular kind of cheese that they make on Fuerteventura.
It's an entire museum devoted to a specific genus of cheese.
Indeed. But you learn a lot about goats. Topology, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of interesting stuff, and cheese. There's even a sort of a mock goat milking setup where you can try and milk a goat yourself. No real goats were harmed for this, but yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Alex, you are, of course, a historian by profession. I'll wager you are yourself not averse to an obscurantist local history museum.
I love an obscurantist local history museum. I'm a big fan, actually, of the ones in the UK, the sort of Victorian museums that have remained unchanged with their dusty cabinets. Mm-hmm. And often...
Is there, in fact, a museum of dusty cabinets?
There probably is. And I mean, I love them because of the way they sort of tell stories and the sort of weird collections of stuff. That sort of... It's kind of often a little bit of a sort of grab bag, that there'll be kind of a room of, OK, here's some stuff we got from Africa, probably should give some of it back. Although usually it's just travel souvenirs, to be honest, sort of fairly low value stuff that some local dignitary has picked up on a trip. And then here's a room of dinosaurs. And we've got one of those. And now here's some art, there'll be something for everyone. Marvellous.
Takes me back to Southampton.
Possibly the first time that sentence has ever been uttered for broadcast. I do get the sense that you would be both willing to fill the rest of this episode with, recollections was the word I wanted, of obscurant reminiscences, in fact, may have been the actual word I wanted, of obscurantist local history museums. But unfortunately, there is a world turning out there. And we will start in Gaza, which was one of the subjects of Pope Francis's last address, as he repeated his oft-stated plea for a ceasefire. There was, for a time, such a truce in operation in Gaza, and over this rare combined Christian and Orthodox Easter, Russian President Vladimir Putin called one in Ukraine. But the ceasefire in Gaza lapsed 34 days and nearly 2,000 more Palestinian dead ago, and the one in Ukraine seems barely to have been observed at all. See also Myanmar, the unpleasant junta governing which called a ceasefire after last month's dreadful earthquake, but is reportedly continuing airstrikes against rebel-held areas. Daniella, I said we would come back to the late Pope Francis, and this is where we do that. He did speak often about Gaza. It wasn't very much not the first time he spoke about it on Sunday. He apparently called Gaza's extremely small Christian community every day as the war went on. But did any of that, and I realise we're getting into the how many divisions has the Pope area here, but did any of that make any difference?
Well, the Pope is an extremely important world figure. I mean, there's no taking away from that. But does he have the same amount of influence, for instance, as the President of the United States of America? Probably not. Not when we talk about geopolitics. But if you wanted an example of soft power, I mean, that's one writ large, really. He's not going to have a direct impact in this particular conflict as well. It's not like there's large numbers of Catholics fighting on either side. But in terms of the optics on it, it's just incredibly, incredibly powerful, for sure.
I mean, that is the question, I guess, was also posed by his visits overseas, the idea that someone in his position does have an amount of moral authority. But did he struggle to project that, do you think, Alex, beyond the Catholic realm?
Actually, I think there was kind of broader respect for him than that, and partly because of those issues he took on, which, as you say, did not just pertain to Catholics in trouble, but to actually taking up issues like Gaza, where obviously there is a Christian community clearly in Palestine, but also, a much larger Muslim community and so forth. And actually to kind of reach out and to care for those communities, I think did actually go beyond a kind of expected audience of Catholics. I think, I thought had a great deal of sort of moral authority and gravitas. But of course, what does that count for if you're dealing with actors who are not themselves particularly affected by it, would be the question. Whereas, of course, the US president has access to things like should we sell them more weapons, which, should we say, is a rather sort of larger lever.
Well, Daniella, let's look a bit at the people who actually make the decisions about whether to cease fire or continue it. Specifically, Russian President Vladimir Putin, his Easter ceasefire was it was an announcement painfully contrived to look as if it was spontaneous, as if the idea had just whimsically occurred to him while in televised conversation with a general. Ukraine claims it was violated not less than 2,000 times, which is an almost impressive number. Is it clear why Putin would declare that he was calling a ceasefire and then clearly not do that?
Well, I mean, Putin originally agreed to a ceasefire in Ukraine in 2014. I think, which lasted a matter of hours, and has been repeatedly broken since then. Look, a ceasefire is a very cynical tool to be used at some points. I don't think one of the major reasons for instituting a ceasefire is to explore the good faith of actors on either side. I don't think there is really much faith that Putin has, can be trusted when it comes to a ceasefire. It works quite well in terms of his own constituency. He gets to show, similarly, as those sort of photos of him riding bare-chested on a tiger. It projects what he wants to project. That sort of statesman-like, I could do peace as well as war. But anyone would be justified in being incredibly cynical about it. At the same time, the two other major issues is that people often mistake ceasefire for peace. So the first Gaza ceasefire sort of held a bit, so people thought, all right, okay, well, that's done now. Okay, there's an absence of active war, so that's peace. And that's completely untrue. Ceasefires can almost hold indefinitely without actually being peace declared. I think there's still just a ceasefire between Pakistan and India over Kashmir. No one's actually gone any further than that. But crucially, what happens, and this is true even of Ukraine, with the ceasefire repeatedly being broken, fewer civilians die in a ceasefire, even if it's an imperfect one. I mean, that's a really important consequence, which we were talking about the leaders and the people making the decisions. That's something that is an outcome, in a way, sort of almost an accidental outcome of ceasefires, but one that's really, really crucial to the people who are suffering in active conflict.
Alex, do they mean quite what they once did back when it was easier to tell who was shooting at who, when there weren't so many deniable aspects to warfare? Everybody could just agree to stand down, play football in no man's land, and we do understand that, fire has ceased.
Well, I mean, you could point to the kind of tech of war in this respect. I mean, obviously, one of the big things that broke the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire this weekend has been drone attacks, for instance. Now, if you want to get really into a technicality, nobody, you could say, well, look, that's not an active thing. That's just a machine doing a thing. But of course, somebody has programmed it to do it. But I mean, I think there's always been, ceasefires haven't, Danielle made the point, it's absolutely correct, that ceasefires have always depended on good faith on both sides then to negotiate something further. That's kind of the point of them, is to give a breathing pause in action so that something can be negotiated. And if nothing can be negotiated, then this is just a sort of stalemate. And if you don't have actors on both sides who want to resolve something, then there's really not much movement that can occur within that. And I think, certainly in the case of Gaza, we're seeing an absolutely horrific situation, humanitarian terms, quite obviously a sort of intolerable situation for civilians there who really do seem to be in an absolutely awful state. But unless that situation can be moved on politically, all a ceasefire really is kind of a break in the bombing and so forth, which obviously may give a sort of temporary relief. Obviously, it's much better to be not being bombed than to be being bombed, but at the same time isn't actually necessarily progressing towards a proper resolution of that situation.
Well, to Germany now, where a deadline was due to elapse today for 4 foreign participants in anti-Israel protests to either depart or be deported. The 4, 2 Irish citizens, 1 Pole and 1 American, were given their marching orders last month in relation to a protest last October at Berlin's Free University. There have been further protests about the proposed deportations in recent days, including one quite rowdy one at Humboldt University last week. Around 100 criminal investigations have since been launched into that. US Vice President J.D. Vance, who has recently been volubly concerned about free speech in Europe, has been mystifyingly silent. Daniella, before we get into the specifics, as a general principle, because this is a case the current US administration has been trying to make, if people do turn up from abroad, regardless of the rights and wrongs of their case, and make a nuisance of themselves, is the country in question entitled to sling them out?
I mean, if they make a criminal nuisance of themselves, then yeah, that would make sense. The issue is that there haven't been there aren't any criminal convictions in this case.
Indeed not.
Yeah, that's one of the issues. I mean, this is a situation which, as amazing as it is to say, both sides are a bit wrong. There isn't a right and there isn't a wrong. In my view, I mean, obviously Germany has got historical baggage when it comes to supporting Israel and these kinds of anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian demonstrations. And at the same time, as a democracy, it has a responsibility to protect freedom of speech. And it needs to deal with that intersection of freedom of speech becoming offensive, which is kind of okay, but also dangerous. It doesn't help that the issue of Palestine has been totally used as a tool in the culture wars by all sides. And it also doesn't help that the protests here and elsewhere have not always been particularly helpful. I've seen it myself. I've been to a few of these demonstrations. Some of them, make me feel uncomfortable. That's fine. That's legitimate. But I was at a conference for Haaretz, is Israel's last only liberal newspaper, which I also contribute to. It's the only newspaper in Israel that's actually reporting on what's happening in Gaza, and it's been consistently anti-occupation, anti-Netanyahu, quite often anti-Zionist. And there was a really quite nasty protest outside of all of these people being very aggressive, filming the participants and the guests, mostly like elderly North London Jews. And you think, really, how is this actually going to promote freedom for Palestine? Like, you know, you're actually feeding into all the tropes. So, okay, it should be, you know, it's not a question of whether you can protest, but also whether you should.
Well, on that thought, Alex, one Berlin state senator, this is Iris Spranger, is attempting to float the slippery slope argument here. She's talking about this becoming a catalyst for radicalization among pro-Palestine activists. And again, there's another aspect of German history which figures here, which is, I guess, the Hamburg cell, which was partially responsible for 9/11, seen to have been largely radicalized by events in Bosnia.
Yes, absolutely. Although, I mean, that's kind of, you know, then we're broadening this out to an incredibly broad discussion of radicalisation generally and all of that. I mean, I think it seems to me that this issue comes down to, you know, again, Danielle raised it, are there criminal convictions here? And there currently aren't. I mean, if the police in Germany would like to charge these protesters with a crime, I think it would be a lot clearer that they'd be on stronger grounds for deportation. I think if they haven't been convicted of anything, then that becomes a rather more tricky question. And it sort of relates to this idea that Germany has this kind of fundamental, you know, and it does have, Germany has a very complicated historical relationship with Israel, obviously. And, you know, this idea of the kind of, I think they call it the Staatsräson, you know, the kind of whether like a crucial part of Germany's like reason to exist is the stability of Israel and all of this. Well, that's quite, I mean, I would say that's quite a debatable point and exactly what that means, especially when the Israel that exists now is, of course, extremely different from the country that was established in 1948 and, you know, and has evolved a lot from that point of view. And whatever your point of view on that and whatever your kind of belief about where that stands currently in the world, that's clearly quite a difficult position for any country to put itself, any nation to put itself in, is that another nation must be defended whatever happens, and that you actually sort of can't speak out against what that nation is doing in another way. I mean, that seems to me quite a tricky position to get into for any nation. That would be very difficult. So, I mean, I think that what needs sorting out here really is, and, you know, I think it will be sorted out because this will be the legal case that will take place, is, you know, whether there are legal strong grounds to deport these people or not under German law. And I mean, I think the thing that I would say at the moment, because obviously we're seeing these cases in the US as well of pro-Palestine protesters, you know, being kind of arrested and, you know, threatened with deportation and all of that. I think at the moment I'd probably have considerably more faith in the German legal system to carry this out in a reasonable manner. But I mean, you know, but this is what the legal system is for, is to test this case and see whether there are grounds for it.
Just one quick follow-up, Alex, rooted in your experience of academia, and this is one of those leading questions betraying the prejudices of the presenter. Should we just not all agree that nobody at all, ever, under any circumstances, over the age of, I'm going to say 25, should pay any attention whatsoever to what occurs on university campuses?
Oh, my goodness, I've argued for that many times. I'm happy to agree with your leading question. You know, you can actually go back and find even in medieval times people complaining about uppity students and their terrible opinions. And you know what? If you're going to have incendiary opinions and all that, studenthood is the time to have them. Just let them do their thing. They'll probably get over most of it. Give them some time. So, I mean, yes, that would be my preference, would be that.
Daniella, would you like to confess to any especially terrible opinions you had as a student?
I'm almost completely unencumbered by education, so I didn't have that problem.
See, I wasn't at university long enough to form any terrible opinions, Alex. Did you have any which you have subsequently recounted?
God, I think my opinions were largely things like, you know, what is the limit of the things you can mix with vodka? Turns out red wine, bad idea.
I could have told you that.
Yes.
We will go now to the United Arab Emirates, which appears gripped by the hotly debatable notion that we are suffering as a planet and a species from a dearth of influencers, i.e. that curious class of person person who is able to make a living by taking stupid photos of themselves standing in front of the thing you're trying to look at. The Tourism Department of Dubai, the obvious enough Vatican of this bewildering creed, has launched an influencer academy, which will offer its students a 3-month course in shilling Dubai, accommodation and expenses included. Daniella, I'm sure there are museums in Dubai as well. Are you tempted by this? Would you like to go to Dubai and become an influencer?
I would like to go to Dubai and become a local history museum consultant. I mean, that would be great. And I would be I think Dubai, the sort of museums and art is a little bit more glitzy than this kind of very niche furrow that I enjoy ploughing. But I mean, obviously, given the age and background of the guests in this studio, I don't think we're I don't think I'm overstepping to say that we're not too influenced by influences. And as a journalist, I find the idea of content creation kind of depressing, really, not without its benefits, but as a sort of an end to a goal, as a sort of career focus, not what the content or the quality of what you produce, but just producing it and having people pay attention is a little bit fatiguing for a woman of my age.
I mean, Alex, it is possible that none of us here in this studio are really the target demographic for this sort of thing, but nevertheless, to the best of your recollection, have you ever yourself been influenced by an influencer?
Oh, well, I think probably yes, actually. I mean, if you look at it in a more broad way, then absolutely. And I would say that, I don't really use TikTok because I just think I'm too old, but Instagram I do, because I think it's okay for old people to be on Instagram. And yeah, I mean, I think
Instagram will be delighted if they're tuning in.
Yeah, thrilled with me just about tolerating.
Not quite decrepit enough for Facebook.
No,
Try Instagram.
No. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, this is, I think what's happening here is that Dubai is trying to bolster its own tourism industry. That's the point. Is that what they want to do is train these influencers up to promote Dubai as the kind of answer. If you're really brilliant at the Influencer Academy, you get a kind of more permanent job making videos and content to make people want to go to Dubai. And you can see why they're doing that at the moment. I mean, if you've been watching the oil price lately, you can fully understand that Dubai wants to diversify somewhat what it's doing. And it does have a considerable tourism industry that it has kind of constructed and all of this. And read in this piece that obviously the population of foreigners is very considerable. And there's about 250,000 Brits living there. Huge numbers, really. So, I mean, that's what this is about, is actually Dubai, I think, trying to diversify its streams of income away from, obviously, the oil is the biggie. And I think it'll be very hard to replicate that with any other industry. But this is, I think, a sort of a buffering that's going on.
I did want to close by asking you both, perhaps, Daniella, in some obscurest local history museum, if you've ever witnessed yourself any especially perplexing or enraging influencer behaviour. Every so often when I'm feeling slightly down, I think back to the time several years ago when I was crossing Sydney Harbour on the Circular Quay to Manly ferry, and there was some gabbling buffoon trying to create some sort of content by yammering into their phone on the end of a selfie stick. And I suspect it was their first crossing from Circular Quay to Manly, and they did not know that on windy days, when there is a swell coming in from the Pacific, when the ferry gets into the bit of the harbour which is exposed between North and South Head, it can get quite suddenly quite bumpy. Anyway, not only did they get absolutely drenched by a plume coming over the bow of the ferry, they dropped their selfie stick into the harbour. Absolutely made my afternoon. And I think the same is true of everybody who witnessed it. So at that level, yes, I have enjoyed the work of an influencer, but not necessarily in the way that they anticipated. Have you ever seen anything such like?
Well, I don't know. I live in Camden, which seems to be quite popular with lots of people who think that matcha ice cream and so on is really the sort of latest. I'm quite fond of matcha ice cream myself, but I do quite like kind of looming into the background of their selfie shots and and gurning a little bit. That gives me a strange small pleasure.
Alex, at any sites of historical interest or import, have you witnessed any such thing?
Do you know, I mean, I think they do rather drive me mad at the historical sites. My husband used to lead tours of tourists to, not tourists, I mean, students to Auschwitz. And he did sometimes have to say to them, can you please not take selfies? just because that's quite tasteless. And unfortunately, some people do need to be told that, it turns out.
Well, on that heartwarming note, Alex von Tunzelmann and Daniella Peled, thank you for joining us. Finally on today's show, by what standard should we judge music and songwriting? The history of popular music is replete with dreadful records by talentless hacks which have sold in their millions, and no less teeming with fantastic records by gifted artists which a plurality of the record-buying public has deemed surplus to their requirements. The question of what a song is worth is meditated upon at length in a new memoir by Alan Tyler, founder of the Rocking Birds, long-time mainstay of London's country music scene, and now the author of How Never to Have a Hit, or How to Never Have a Hit. I think that's the right order. The Confessions of an Unsuccessful Singer-Songwriter. I spoke to Alan at Midori House earlier and began by asking him how close to a hit he thought he'd ever actually got.
No, not really. It always seemed completely elusive, although I get in trouble. I'm chastened by people who say, well, Alan, you were on Top of the Pops, so what are you talking about? We were part of a Heavenly Records charity effort with the Fred EP, which was 3 of the label's acts, ourselves, St Etienne and Flowered Up, each doing one of Right Said Fred's big 3 hits. And as I explain in the book, we are offered the opportunity to do our song, Deeply Dippy, on Top of the Pops. The record has gone to number 26, and this is in 1992, in the hit parade.
But these things are all relative, which does prompt a contemplation of the book's subtitle, which you describe as Confessions of an Unsuccessful Singer-Songwriter. But you've had a 40-year career at this now. You have written songs that people remember decades after they were recorded.
I have. I've been very persistent. You know, I do sort of observe that, you know, success is relative, but achievement is absolute. You know, I mean, imagine, you know, not that I'm comparing myself to the Beatles, but imagine the Beatles had none of their records been hits. Their achievement would still have been grand, wouldn't it? They would be still good records.
They would
I think, you know, there are a lot of us out there, you know, who don't, you know, make a lot of records. But I think I do sort of lay claim to being someone who's been very persistent over a very long period of time, making a fair number of records. 12 albums, not bad.
It's not bad at all. But you have ploughed what seems an unorthodox or unlikely furrow in the context of being a British musician, which is that you are broadly a country musician. And how did that start for you? How does someone from Harrow, Middlesex, become a country singer?
I suppose I was always casting about after the explosion of punk rock and me believing literally that was the end of rock and roll. I was always looking for something different to do, and for a little while I dallied with sort of swingy pop in the 80s. And then, as I tell in the story in the book, I finally get around to listening to country music and realise that, one, it's nice and easy to play.
All those big open chords.
Two, it's big on lyrics, you know, which is probably what I'm better at than the technicalities of music. That's more where I am, more of a sort of like song guy. And so I sort of settled into that and, you know, got cracking with it. And that was towards the end of the 80s. And people thought it was fun. We landed in I located myself in Camden, where the whole sort of like NME kind of was new music press sort of centre of the universe was for up and coming indie bands. Venues like the Falcon was my actual literal local pub, and we just went for it. And we come. Although we were a country band, we were surrounded by these shoegazer bands, and, the Camden Lurchers, and so we stuck out. It's a good way of getting noticed, you know, by doing something that
it's the thing no one else was doing.
So
exactly.
My strategy.
But did you find it ever difficult or incongruous to apply this most American of musics to, I guess, British themes and British subjects? Because you never sang in an American accent, and you never sort of did the thing of moving to Nashville and being a British guy writing songs about trucks. The Rocking Birds records did sound like they were, for all that they were country records, they sounded like they were made by a band from London.
Yeah, I think I was fairly careful about that, not being a real yeehaw band. It took us a long time before we just even had the temerity to wear a cowboy hat, you know. we were sort of thinking, well, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles sold, R&B and back to the Americans in the form of the beat explosion and changed the course of rock and roll history. And we thought that might happen to us, Didn't quite, really. So the Americans absolutely were completely uninterested. I think we did one gig in the Continental Club in Austin in 1992, and Joe Ely, who was in the audience, was reported to have said that, what were these limeys doing over here, stealing our music, I mean, I thought that's rather ungrateful, as we probably had the English probably had a bit of a hand in forming, American country music historically, but we didn't actually get a release in America so it didn't. I think we were kind of into the Graham Parsons, the Cosmic American music, and I was thinking about that the other day. I don't think Americans were much into that, really, and the big
at the time. No, not really.
No, it wasn't really a thing. So that it was more of a music that, kids like us who were into the Byrds and stuff, it's more of a British thing to be into that kind of country music. So that's why we picked it up and took it where we did.
That was Alan Tyler, and that is Alan Tyler and the Rocking Birds playing us out. Alan's new book, How to Never Have a Hit, The Confessions of an Unsuccessful Singer-Songwriter, is available now. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Alex von Tunzelmann and Daniella Peled, also to Juliet Linley at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.